Hi there, and welcome to another episode of African Business Stories, your insight into female innovators and entrepreneurs building and running businesses in Africa. I'm Akego Okoye, and on the show today, I'll be chatting with Nokwazi Mzobe, founder and CEO Matoyana Business Solutions, a Johannesburg-based consulting firm. We talk about stumbling into entrepreneurship, going beyond consultancy to content creation. Her first book, The Small Business Handbook, is available in English and isiZulu. We talk overcoming imposter syndrome and much more. Let's get into it. Hi, Nokwazi. Welcome to African Business Stories.
Hi, Kayla. Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here.
So you were born and raised in Durban, South Africa?
Yes, I was.
For the benefit of our listeners who aren't familiar with South Africa, when people talk about being raised in the township, what does that mean?
Well, it's very unique to South Africa. With apartheid, what happened is that they got people from the villages and basically took people from the villages to come and work in the cities to service, I would say, white business or white minds. And literally, the white government then created these communities that are called townships. So and that's why, even though you can Google the word township and we'll talk about in I guess a general, let's say, English dictionary, it will say a township is like a village or whatever. In South Africa, it signifies a community that was specifically set up for Black Africans, for Indians, and also we also have a category in South Africa that's called colored, which are the mixed race people, because of apartheid. That was the power of apartheid is, divide and conquer and separate. So they created these specific communities, and these communities are called townships.
What was like life growing up in one of those townships?
I mean, I think for me, it's what I knew until you travel and you see the rest of the world, and you really kind of understand, wow, how unique our history is, and all these specific communities that were created. For me as well, as much as I lived in the township, I didn't necessarily grow up in the township per se. And the reason is that so kind of being born under apartheid, towards the end of apartheid, when it was very violent and people were fighting, and I mean, I even remember when I was young, when the army came into the townships to now control us, to control the Blacks, because there was a lot of uprising and so forth. My parents sent all of us to boarding school, and it was a Catholic boarding school, run by German nuns.
Okay.
And it was also quite unique in that time because it was actually one of the very few multiracial schools that existed. And so I only went home every quarter. So I used to be it was a boarding school. So yeah, and we all went to boarding school, my family, especially when we were younger, because it was safer than us being in the township and experiencing the violence that was happening at that time. Because as we were also transitioning out of apartheid, there was also then the clash between the ANC and the IFP. So there's a lot of violence. And for my parents, it was safer for us to be away in boarding school than to be living in the township. And just to point out, like my older sister, she didn't enjoy boarding school, so my parents eventually brought her back. And so there used to be protests, like to stay away from going to work and stuff like that. So my dad used to make her dress in civil, in like your normal day wear, and hide her books underneath, in the boots underneath stuff, because she went also to a school outside of the township. And it would look like, okay, they're just driving somewhere, but she was actually driving to school. And if they had been caught, I mean, you could have been burnt. So it was very tricky, kind of growing up in the township in the 80s. And I think very different to what it is today.
Wow. That's thank you for that story and that reminder of the risk that our parents take sometimes to give us the best education possible. Thank you for that. So you then went on to college. So where did you go to college and what did you study?
So I went to the University of, at the time, University of Natal. Today is known as University of KwaZulu-Natal, which was in Durban. And I studied a Bachelor of Science in cell biology. And my second major was in psychology. And then I had all these aspirations of then, being a clinical psychology, and I was very interested in just neurobiology and so forth. And I went and did my honors degree at Wits University. So I managed to, well, I got a scholarship, and so moved up to Johannesburg. And I just remember for my thesis, I had to work in Baragwanath Hospital, which is the biggest hospital, government hospital, in, I'd say, Gauteng, and I actually think in the whole of the country. And I was doing specific research on women with
Hmm.
HIV, and basically just testing their, well, looking at their locus of control, women who have HIV and HIV positive children, and women
Hmm.
who have HIV and HIV negative children. And if it was very interesting. But I think for me, it was quite an experience where I was really introduced to the trauma of what I'd say people from our communities have gone through. Because
Yeah.
when you hear the stories, a lot of the stories were stories of gender-based violence, of husbands not wanting to use protection, and if they said they wanted to use protection, they'll be like, "Why are you sleeping with somebody else?" So I think for me at that young age, um, it was just eye opening. And I think I realized that as much as I wanted to become a clinical psychologist, I felt by the end of my degree that I was not ready. I felt like, I wouldn't. I would not be able to empathize in the way that I needed to in order to be the best psychologist that I could be.
Oh,
Um, and so that's when I kind of changed my mind and said, well, I'm not sure if I want to be a clinical psychologist anymore. And I'm not sure if I want to be a biologist. Well, the biologist, I was very clear. I think once I started spending, because you spent a lot of time in labs. So I
right.
always used to compare myself to my friends. We used to be in lab until 5, 6 in the evening. And, those who did commerce or did drama, the arts, they were hanging out and having fun. So I was just like, if this is going to be the rest of my life, I don't want to be doing this.
Right.
So what was quite interesting is that we in South Africa, and I guess most of the world, a lot of companies come recruit on campus.
Hmm.
And so since there was campus recruitment, I just started applying. And basically I attended one of the Procter and Gamble graduate recruitment processes, and that's how I got into business.
Yeah. So you got into Procter and Gamble and I understand you were there for about what, 5 years?
Yes, I was there just for over 5 years.
5 years, and you had so many different roles at Procter and Gamble. So can you talk to us a bit about what you were doing at Procter and Gamble and more importantly, what that experience did for you?
So Procter and Gamble was very interesting. So I mean, for me, having studied science and biology and psychology, I had no clue about the business world. I did not know there was FMCG or whatever. The only company I really knew of was Unilever, because their head offices are in Durban, um, and their factories. So a lot of people in our township worked for the Unilever factories,
Okay.
and that's kind of what I knew about them. And then, Procter and Gamble, I get recruited, and I remember telling my friends, and they were so excited, especially the ones who did BCom in marketing, a bachelor of commerce. And so I was just like, what is this company? And I remember going online and like researching them. And then I was offered a role in logistics. And again, I had never heard of the word logistics. And I remember doing research. I was just I was just happy that I was recruited straight from university. And I think, again, looking at our history in South Africa, it was a big thing that, you got into university and now you got a job at a big multinational. So it was a big, big thing. I even remember the letter of acceptance and on the dining room table at home, and how excited my mom and my brother were for me. Um, and so, getting into Procter and Gamble and getting into this role called logistics, and I really had no clue. But also for me, what was quite interesting is that I came in at a manager one level in logistics, and logistics was quite interesting, quite different in terms of the levels that people maybe were recruited in other departments. People kind of came in more at an admin level and kind of went up the ladder. I came in straight from university at a level one. And also, what was quite interesting, for me, it's quite important to always touch about race when you talk about, specifically in South Africa, because race is just a big determinant of your career and the environment and how you experience life over here. And so for me, entering P&G was great and an amazing company, but also there were dynamics in my department around race. There hadn't been a Black person at that level in that department, maybe in other departments. So I remember it was the first time in my life where I actually really started experiencing race and race issues, even though I grew up in apartheid South Africa. And that's the interesting thing. I think my primary and high school, even though I went to predominantly white schools, so I mean, I didn't touch on this, but high school, I got a scholarship into a prestigious, private school, and there were only two Black kids in my class. But somehow, because of the environment, and both her and I were academic, we got academic scholarships. So there was something about the environment that protected us. And but there was something about going into work. And I remember my boss, who at the time was Egyptian, and he just didn't get the South African dynamics. He used to be very honest with me. He used to be like, you can't let the ball drop. You need to work harder. I remember being given more work, more assignments. I was given the project to set up the standard operating processes for that whole department in my first year. And that should ideally be given to someone who's worked a while, because they should know the standard operating procedures. So I had that on top of my job, and then also just me being who I was involved in like employment equity committee and all these other things. I loved the company. The culture was great, but the way, I guess, yeah, the way I came into this department had a specific role to play. But what it did for me, and this is the power of what it did for me, is that it exposed me to so many things. And so because of all those additional responsibilities, I was able to showcase my capabilities. I learned to speak up for myself quite quickly. And then when I went into new roles, I was able to say to my boss, oh, I don't like this role, or I prefer to do this, because I just had to be confident in order to survive in that department. And so for me, it was great because I learned the systems of the company. I had to meet everybody in the organization when I had to do those SOPs. So I got to network across and upwards. Um, and then eventually I was moved to a new role, which is called demand forecasting. And there I got to really interact with the commercial team and the GM and the VP. And then from those roles, I guess, my boss saw talent in me. And when P&G acquired Wala, I was part of the integration team. So that gave me a lot of exposure, because it was, how do we now integrate two companies? And that gave me great exposure. And then when P&G acquired Gillette, I was also then the lead for the logistics and supply chain department for Sub-Saharan Africa. And just to give you context there, I think I was probably about 26, 27 when I had that role. I think what it did for me, it gave me a taste of entrepreneurship, but slightly in a slightly different way, because I felt like all the roles I got put in were either roles that didn't exist, or roles that were, because of the integrations, it was a very different environment compared to the the standard operating of the business.
Mm.
And so for me, PNG was just a great experience in that sense, is that I got exposure, I worked with amazingly smart people. I got to travel, and not just travel across the continent, but also travel the world. And I think
Mm.
to even go back to my first role in logistics, as much as I didn't like it at the time, today as an entrepreneur, I think it's a blessing in disguise, because it's a department that people undervalue, but it's a department that if it doesn't work, your business operations don't work.
That's awesome. So you then moved to Nokia
Yes.
and also moved countries.
Yes.
So talk to us about that.
So 5.5 years at Procter and Gamble, and then I kind of got itchy feet.
Hmm.
And it was the first time ever that I actually put my CV out. And I think for me, the key thing at the time, being very ambitious, I had a clear goal that I wanted to be a GM. So I was very clear that I'm not a specialist. I'm a general manager, and I wanted, a, I won't say a quick route, but a company that had a clear route to general management. And I also felt that I wanted to be in a different industry. So I'd spent 5.5 years in FMCG. So, I just said, wherever I go to afterwards, it cannot be another FMCG company. And so when Nokia came along, the initial offer was for a role that I had no interest in. So initially I declined it, and they called me back and they were like, "We'd like to speak to you. We're really fascinated by your CV."
Okay.
And the reason why I'm mentioning that is that, the specific manager at the time, he was really fascinated in my story and me as an individual. And I remember him saying, "I don't have a role for you. I agree that this role that we're looking for is not the role for you, but I want you to work for me.
Hmm.
So we will,"
Wow.
he's like, "I will find a role for you and I'll call you back." And 6 months later, I got a call and he was just like, "We're opening a new department," which was like a demand forecasting, but a financial demand forecasting. And I went and I interviewed for that, and I got the role. And it was based in South Africa, but it was a great role as well, because I basically had to interact with all the general managers from all the regions on the continent, and all the heads of sales. And basically, I would kind of consolidate and do the forecasting for Africa. And then I used to be the one reporting back to
Right.
global in terms of how we're performing. I did quite well in that role, and within 9 months, I was promoted to head business controller, but it's also a finance and control role. And that's when I moved to Nairobi.
Right.
My career was so fast track. So I got that role. To give you context, I was 28, turning 29.
Hmm.
And on average, I was 10 years younger than my peers in the lead team.
Wow.
And so I think for me, it was a great role. I did well. Within the first year, I got awards for like current best practice in terms of internal control processes and putting things in place. But I think halfway through, I really started questioning, is this what I want to do? Because I got into, I would say, top management so quickly and so young, and I felt
Hmm.
like I didn't have a coach, I didn't have a mentor. I mean, my then boss, the one who hired me, he was amazing. So he was my career sponsor, and he was just
Hmm.
like, if you work hard, you can get to general management. But there was
Right.
just something in me that just I wasn't happy. I was working
Hmm.
hard, I was meeting the targets, but there was just this void and this gap.
So what did you do?
So what I started doing is that I then started asking myself, is there something else?
Hmm.
At the time, I was very much a typical, this is my plan, this is my goal, and this is where I'm going to. I'd never really thought about anything else.
Hmm.
And so I just thought, let me take a time out. But for me, time out was going back to school.
Right.
Um, and I'd always, because I studied science and psychology, and now I was in a finance role, I always had like this imposter syndrome of, because people would always ask, "What did you study?" And then they'd be like, "But how can you be finance, head of finance, and you studied psychology, so I always had that. So I thought, let me do my MBA.
Right.
And literally that's how I decided to go do an MBA, to take a break. And the logic at the time was take a break and also give myself the confidence to next time somebody asked me this question, I'd say, well, I have a business degree as well, which is why I can do this role. And that's how I decided to do my MBA. And I did it in the US, and specifically because I was very clear that I wanted to have an international experience and continue to grow my international network. So I was very, very choiceful of that. The university I went to was called Hult.
Okay.
Um, it was the former Arthur D. Little School of Business, and I think was acquired by a Swedish company. What was interesting is that it wasn't your traditional B school at the time.
Okay.
So I know from Africa, everybody was like, why don't you apply to an Ivy League? Why don't you? And I was just like, I don't want to be at school for 2 years. I just want 1 year out and to then go back into corporate. I just want a year to think. And that's how I remember just calling my boss and saying that I think I need a timeout. And they agreed to allow me to go on sabbatical. And then I left and I moved to the US.
So what was living in the US like? What was that whole experience like for you?
It, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it. And I think the reason why I did, one, I think just Massachusetts is it's just known. It's full of universities and it's just suitable for being a student. Um, and I think the other thing as well is that because it was just this new environment, and I think for me being away from home, so it's just to give you an example, I've always been responsible. So I was that child that was a hit girl. I got a job part-time when I was at home. I always did everything right and in the right way. And it was the first time I actually felt I could be myself. Like I could be something else and not the super responsible
Right.
Nokwazi. And I think the US allows you to do that because it just has the environment that allows you to have fun, but also study at the same time. So in that sense, I really enjoyed being there.
So you had this 1 year to think while you were experiencing a new culture and, the dynamics of the US. And how did your thinking go?
Oh, it was interesting. So I think for me, what the US did for me is that it's entrepreneurial. Like I remember the Cheesecake Factory, and I'm seeing all these businesses where I'm like, huh? So people are like creating like franchises of like the weirdest things, well, in my head. And it just kind of exposed me to just creative the culture is. And so when I came back home, um, I just couldn't get myself to go back to work.
Right.
So, I mean, and just to point out the context at the time is when Nokia was going through its downhill and it was being acquired by Microsoft. Um, so I remember my boss was just like, look, we're going through another restructure. Just wait a bit. And once we have a role for you, you'll come back. And so that was great because I was on sabbatical and it just gave me time to think. And so I decided to volunteer during that time, and I volunteered for a program that was supporting women in business, and really just gave me the time to volunteer and explore. And I remember the first time my boss said, "Okay, here's a role for you," and I was just like, "No, I can't have gone and done my MBA and seen the world and come back and do a role like that." But I think in my head, I still wasn't clear that I didn't want to go back to corporate. And
Right.
then he came back with another role, and I declined it. And then he came back with a third role, which I think would have been perfect from I'd say my career progression that I had planned pre my MBA.
Right.
But what had happened in my volunteering stint is that people started asking me if I consult,
Right.
and people encouraged me to turn what I was doing into a business. And I remember I got my first big contract with quite a big development agency that was doing research about entrepreneurship across the SADC region. And I remember my boss called me literally the day I was starting that consulting gig. And I said to him, you know what? I think I want to see where this is going to take me.
Hmm.
So I think my sabbatical is over. I think I'm officially
Wow.
resigning, and I want to explore this entrepreneurship thing. And I think that's what doing my MBA in the US did, is that it opened me up to the possibility of you creating your own opportunities.
Right.
Coming from apartheid South Africa, being black, the big thing was get educated, go to university, and go get a
Hmm.
job. And if you've got a job, climb up the ladder and you've got that status. And I think the US kind of opened up my mind and exposed me to so much. And I think coming back, I was just like, no, I'm thinking differently. I'm seeing things differently. And that's what it did for me. And I really believe if I had chosen to do my MBA in South Africa, I'd still be in corporate
Right.
today. Yeah.
Hmm. That's very interesting. So you kind of stumbled into entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So how did you go about setting up? So you got this gig, you're doing this, and you think, oh wow, I'm actually an entrepreneur. So what was the formal process of setting up?
So when I come back and I was still thinking about what I wanted to do, and I'd gone back home, I was just chilling and doing nothing. I think my family was very worried because first time in their whole life they'd seen me with no direction. And my
Hmm.
mom said to me, go register a business. And I remember her taking me in South Africa. We have centers that are government led. It's a government agency called
Hmm.
CEDA and Small Enterprise Development Agency. And I remember my mom taking me there and her giving me 500 Rand to register a business. And I chose the name Matoyana. So my mom's, I would say, she calls me Toyana. So as you know, Africans, we have family clan names. And Toyana is one of the clan names from my dad's side. And my dad passed away when I was young. Um, and so the name was quite special to me. So I was just like, if I choose the word Toyana, I feel like, my dad will be walking with me in the journey. Um,
Hmm.
and the name was already taken up. And then my mom was just like, well, Ma Toyana, because Ma feminizes the name. And that's how we got to the name Ma Toyana, and I registered the business. So as I was volunteering, I had this company that was registered but was dormant in a sense. Um,
Okay.
and so when I first got this big contract, luckily I already had this business set up. Well, the company registered, so
Right.
it was really quite quick because I just had to quickly open up a business bank account, show them my documents, and literally that was the first invoice I really invoiced under the business. So
Hmm.
and that was pretty much how I started off. And this is where then my studies helped me because I did specialize in entrepreneurship and innovation in the US, and I chose a lot of entrepreneurial modules. Uh, that
Hmm.
I did have the interest. And so I started putting that into practice. Just, setting up a website, having social media presence. The other thing that I was very clear about is that, in terms of my network was all in corporate. I did not have a network in the space I'd entered in. So for me, the volunteering gig became really critical because it was through GIBS, so the Gordon Institute of Business Science, which is a business school here in South Africa, and it really has a strong business name. So I continued volunteering and then became a business coach for the
Hmm.
entrepreneurial programs. And what that did, it gave me the credibility. So
Right.
that I wouldn't have had just as a lone young black girl saying, hey, I'm a consultant in this space. And also, what happened over there is that a lot of the entrepreneurs who were part of their programs would then ask me afterwards to come and consult. And really that's how I slowly grew, is that I volunteered. A lot of those guys now became my clients, and then they started
Right.
referring me to people, and then I had the Gibbs name behind me in the sense that a lot of the programs I was volunteering for and mentoring on. So it gave me that credibility. And that's where I started interacting with corporate clients because a lot of exec ed programs. So that's when I started then getting exposure to some corporate clients. And funny enough, whilst doing research for another business, I went and I approached Procter and Gamble just because I still knew people there, and I was like, I'm doing this research. I want to see, but since you guys are corporate and I know you, what advice would you give to a small business? And I remember having this meeting, and the person there was just like, hey, actually, we have this problem that we're trying to solve. And at the time, I was like, oh, I think this is what you can do, and this is just now being from my experience being in the entrepreneurial environment and understanding the landscape and the legislature. And the lady was like, well, it sounds like you know what you're doing. Why don't you pitch for the gig? And I was it's not what I do. I just do kind of coaching and whatever and entrepreneurship. She's like, well, just send us a proposal. And I went and I wrote this proposal, and I realized retrospectively, I was pitching even against the business school that I was coaching on behalf, and I got the gig from them. That was my first big corporate role. I mean corporate client. Um, and that's
Right.
how I think for me, what makes it very different, the whole stumbling in, is that my business grew because of referral, and also timing is so important in entrepreneurship. So, when I came back from the US, the legislation was really about supporting entrepreneurs, and we have an act called Triple BE, so broad-based Black economic empowerment. And part
Right.
of it is, so really it's about addressing basically the inequalities that were caused by apartheid. Um, so a lot of it is what corporates can do internally, but also how can they support Black businesses, and how can there be more
Right.
Black entrepreneurs? And so that was what was happening at the time. So I feel like, the business started at the right time. There were just a lot of opportunities. So I got the corporate roles. I had the business school that I continued, be so it moved from volunteering to become an actual business mentor on their programs. And literally my business grew basically from meeting people in this environment, and a lot of it has been referral. I always say to people, 99% of the work that I have even today, 7 years
Hmm.
having run this business, is referral. I actually
Interesting.
have only succeeded at one pitch, and that was the first pitch. The rest I have always failed at, but I always seem to get work, and it's come from my
That
network.
is very interesting. You run this for 7 years or so. You've been doing this for 7 years. And then I understand that at some point you decided to pivot
Yes.
and switch up your business model or a little bit. So can you tell us a bit about that pivot?
So because I was really servicing if I had to make it use a terminology that's accessible to everybody, I was servicing incubators and accelerators. Um,
Okay.
and so a lot of people, for me to grow, would say to me, why don't you start your own accelerator? And I was like, I don't see a need because there's so many. And I just, be just another player in the fray. But what it did for me, because I had I say a plug-in model, and I consulted to so many different organizations that were working with small businesses and entrepreneurs across just a range. I realized
Hmm.
there was a gap in local content,
Right.
really speaking to the local entrepreneur. And that's where I saw the opportunity to write the small business handbook. And really, it was because people would say, so now I've attended this program for 12 weeks, for 6 weeks, or whatever, and I've been taught all the business skills and how to run a business. But it's very different to when I implement. I wish I had the tools with me now that I can utilize now that I'm running my business. And that's
Right.
where I saw the opportunity and I wrote the book. Um, And what was interesting is just the interest that was garnered in terms of the people who bought the book. A lot of the people who bought the book were the accelerators, were the incubators. There were people who were calling me and saying that, oh, we're using the book as a training manual. So it was quite interesting just to see how people were utilizing it. And for the first time, okay, I just got to a point where I was just like, I've done so much work in the 7 years, but because I'm a consultant, I can't speak about it as my own work because you sign
Mm,
NDAs, you're doing it. So even if you've created something from scratch for a client and they were just like, here's the problem, and you've designed this whole thing, you can't speak about it as your own. And I eventually got to a place where I was just like, actually, and the book made me see that because the book was the first thing, a product that I put out to the market. And I actually, in a sense, felt like a real entrepreneur now because there was a product that I owned. Um,
right.
and so it then I just saw the opportunity of creating content, not just for initially it was for these accelerators, but South Africa, we have the highest Gini coefficient in the world. We have a huge unemployment rate, and I just realized there's a lot of people who are interested in starting small businesses but can't attend an accelerator incubator because most of them as well are in the Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town, and maybe two other smaller cities. But I'm like, there are a lot of people in small towns who actually need the skill, who need this
Mm,
knowledge. So how can I make this business knowledge accessible to more people? And that's when I started getting the idea. I was like, creating content. Just, create content and make it accessible. So
mm,
it was almost a subconscious shift because I wasn't thinking about it from your typical, here's a business plan, business model, how do you monetize? I just started doing it.
mm,
And what's happened is that I started garnering a following, and people were like, don't you want to create a podcast? Don't you want to do this? Don't you want to do that? So I had a lot of people throw things at me, but I was just like, I wasn't sure, and being, I guess, typical analyst, um, it took me a while, but now I kind of got the clarity that actually this is the right direction. It's the direction that I have been moving towards, but I've been moving towards it in an unstructured way. So, for example, the small business handbook, it was initially a pitch I'd done for a client. And then we negotiated and they allowed me to own my IP and publish it and make it accessible. I have designed courses and online courses for other organizations. So I realized I'm already doing content
right.
creation, but I'm just doing it for other people. But now, how do I make it accessible? And that's really kind of is the thinking that I am at the moment, is that how do I make it accessible to just the broad public? But also, I think for me, when I look at South Africa, and I think Africa in general, is that just because of colonization and our history, we we're taught to go work, to go get jobs, and to go work for someone. I feel that our creative spirit is killed. And when you look at the middle class, most of the middle class are working for these big organizations. You see a lot of survivalist entrepreneurship and people at that level, but really like I would say just what we see in the US in terms of entrepreneurship, there's a huge opportunity. Um, and for me, I just have this thing of how can we get more people to realize that they can create and they can
Mm,
build their own, it doesn't matter whether it's a small business or something that they can own and be able to earn their own money and not necessarily, and I think specifically in South Africa, because unemployment is just so high, that they learn the skills of starting something and making money themselves instead of graduating and searching for a job. And so that's kind of where, now I'm slowly finding, I guess, my passion and just clarity, where it's not just now I'm consulting on behalf of other businesses because I want to help and I want to make a difference. Now it's like, how do I do it? And I do it in a way that I'm addressing the issues that I see in the country, but also addressing some of the issues that I experienced in the last 7 years. That I feel that, other women and other black businesses and other small businesses shouldn't necessarily have to go through. And it's all about, you don't know what you don't
Hmm.
know. So for me, that's really the direction I'm slowly moving and pivoting towards.
What challenges have you faced as a business owner, as a female business owner in a country like South Africa? Could you just talk us through some of those challenges, what you've learned from them, how you've overcome those that you have overcome,
So for me, I would say the the first challenge, and I'd say, it's quite funny because I mean I'm trying to think about it, and this is where I always underestimate myself, because I always say to myself, "Oh, my challenges aren't that big compared to other people." But I think there's one: imposter syndrome. I mean, the space that I entered in, consulting, it's largely male, it's largely white. And I remember when I was starting off, and a client had asked me to run a specific workshop, and that's running it for a group of it's a range of women running a range of businesses, standing over there, and a lady saying to me, "Are you old enough to be in front of us?" In the front, that was her question as I was starting the day. The most disconcerting, and
yeah.
something that I'd never seen my male counterparts being asked. I had another situation where somebody said, "How did you how did this business school take you on?" Like it was, you could see it was almost like incredulous. And I was just like, the normal way that they bring in consultants and facilitators, and you know and then he was like, "Which school did you go to?" And it was just like, "Oh, is it online?" Just the constant having to almost like validate myself
Hmm.
all the time. And that for me, I would say, has been the biggest challenge. And I think I still get it today. And I always say it's the triple factor: you black, you female. And at the time, I say I was young. For me, it was I would say that those were my biggest challenges, to almost have to say to people, um I know my work, I'm good at it, and I have every right to be here as much
Right.
as you have the right to be here, and I can deliver at the same level. Also pricing, being challenged on my pricing. Again, it goes back to, so people be like, but why are you charging this rate? Or this is the rate we're offering you, and then you find out that other people are getting rates higher than you. So for me, those were really, like, I would say, the challenges that I faced, and then my own challenges, right? So I'd say my own challenges is that also when I started off, my business model just did not make sense. And so I knew within like 10 months in my business that if I don't relook my business model, this business is going to fail. So I had to
Right.
spend a lot of time rethinking my business model, and really like looking. And this is how going to corporate clients, that corporate client that I mentioned, they actually, in a sense, it was the universe pushing me into a new business model, because they were like, "No, you can still service small businesses, but we pay you." Because a lot of the small businesses that I serviced couldn't pay me. So I gave a lot of my services for free starting off, and it was just unsustainable. So that was another big challenge. And also, then I'd say the other challenge is underpricing. The problem with underpricing is that it really takes a lot for you to increase your pricing. So
Right.
when I had, now I had a large group of clients, and they were now used to this rate that I had been charging. And, the more I got exposed, and the more I saw how underpriced I was, very few clients were willing to change pricing. And I just realized that, my pricing model, I'd really undervalued myself. And so, just from a business side, those were some of the challenges, just from maybe me not knowing how to price properly, not knowing how to position myself properly, that had an impact on the actual business model. Um,
Mhm.
and and that took some time in terms of having to rework and me kind of getting out of, because then what ended up happening is that because I priced incorrectly, I couldn't bring in as many resources as I would need for certain projects. So I'd end up working crazy overtime in order to deliver for projects that if I'd priced correctly, I could have priced for more headcount
Mm.
in order to deliver. So I think for me, those were some of just the pains that I went through. Um, and I'd say the last one has been a solopreneur.
Mm.
And it's not that I necessarily wanted. I looked for business partners. I struggled to find people that were compatible. I had a failed partnership on another business I tried with someone else. And so, people always say, should you go solo or should you partner? And I was like, well, it's almost a chicken egg situation. Just know that when you go solo, there's just you do so much more. And it's so important that you collaborate. You have to really have the network to collaborate with a lot of people. Whereas when you have a partner, you have somebody who's just there with you, has your back, can focus on the stuff that you know um, you're not great at. You split the work, and there's accountability on both sides. So I look back and I always say, if I had a business partner, I really think I would have been able to scale and move quicker than I did working by myself.
Right.
But on the flip side, is that not having a business partner and being the person that I am, is that I'm more driven by passion and purpose.
Mm.
So I have sometimes, well, not have sometimes, most of the time, chosen more passion work than money work. So sometimes you look at work that's coming through, and I would rather go for more of a piece of work that is more about solving a social issue versus going for a piece of work where I know that I'm going to get great money, but I feel like the purpose and passion return is not going to come. And so
Mm.
because of that, I feel like I've had the freedom to
Right.
work with people whose, I guess, my values are more aligned with. Yeah.
Interesting. So we're in the midst of COVID, and South Africa is one of the most affected countries on the continent. So how are you in your business supporting SMEs and micro businesses in South Africa?
So what was interesting is that in 2017, I did a pilot project where I was supporting micro entrepreneurs in our poorest communities. So basically in the informal settlements and also in our townships. So what had happened is that last year I managed to get sponsorship to run a program in an area called Diepsloot, which is one of the poorest communities in Johannesburg.
Mhm.
Um, and what was quite interesting is that when I designed it, I'd seen, obviously we have the digital gap as well. Um, and one thing I noticed is that um, our poor communities, everybody has a cell phone, everybody has a smartphone.
Right.
And in my design of the program, I had thought to myself, how can we teach these women how to use their smartphones as a computer? And so basically, we designed this program to have a whole lot of digital literacy. So now, why am I mentioning this? Is that I didn't know that COVID was going to come.
Hmm.
So I have this program that weekly we are running a program to upskill these women and make their businesses sustainable. And COVID hits.
Right.
And South Africa had one of the hardest lockdowns, and which meant that we weren't seeing these women and we weren't supporting them. And we were able to get them to do online courses, and I would transfer data to them. And we got them to do a UNICEF course on how to run a play school. We found some free online courses that we were encouraging them to do, and and then also the way we had designed the program, and something I'd learned from the 2017 pilot is that women from these communities face a lot of issues around gender-based violence and so forth. So I had designed the program to have a lot of personal development. I was like, if we really develop the individual and give them basically the skills, the soft skills that they need to overcome certain hardships. And what we found is that even though we taught them financial literacy and marketing and all of that, what made them survive COVID
Hmm.
were those soft skills.
Wow.
And we had a community analyst. Our community analyst was calling them every week, checking in on them. How are you doing? Where are you? We created a WhatsApp group. We created a Facebook group. And just to keep them engaged. And here we are, 5 months under lockdown, and all of them are ready to restart their businesses. We gave them small capital just to be able to buy sanitizers and stuff like that. But even if we hadn't, those women are so resourceful. They were just like, we will find a way to restart. For me, what it actually showed me, and I think it's just for the rest of Africa, is that we are largely informal businesses. And
Hmm.
sadly, these informal businesses don't have access to the support, the formal support that government had.
Hmm.
So, although government had all these packages that were accessible to small businesses, business rescue plans, funding, and this particular group could not access because they didn't necessarily meet the compliance. And so then it got me thinking, and I was like, as much as I've given all these women these skills, and some of them can become compliant, but some of them it will be really difficult. What they still need, though, they have every right as inhabitants of this country, citizens of this country, running businesses, to have access to all this formal support. And so I've been inspired to look at a social innovation fund of of making it accessible to survivalist entrepreneurs, but tapping into this government funding. So me as an individual, as a Black business, access this funding and then saying this is how we're going to utilize it to support this sector
Wow.
of of our economy that wouldn't formally meet the criterion because they, I don't know, don't have the certificate, and they're not tax compliant, and all of these things. And so that's what I'm looking at now in terms of how do I take this project and spin it off into something else that's more sustainable, and hopefully something that can also scale and support similar type businesses across the country, and I'm hoping across the continent.
That's excellent. That's excellent. So apart from this social innovation fund, and as my final question, what's next for you, Nokwazi, and what's next for Matoyana?
So I think for me, what's next is that I'm very clear on my vision. And my vision is making knowledge accessible so people can create their own opportunities and solve their own problems. So because I'm quite clear about that, I'm just about how do I do that in a way that's impactful. And so I'm continuing. I've spun out my consulting, and I'm more focused. I work with specific organizations, and that's just me alone in the business, and that has an element of coaching. And then Matoyana is really going to become, the social innovation fund, specifically targeting survivalist entrepreneurs, and I'm focusing on play school industry, right? Because there's a huge gap over there. Um, then I'm looking at content, like I said, the small business handbook. How do I make it into an online learning course? How do we make it accessible to more people? Also, it's really key for me. South Africa has 11 official languages, but most business knowledge is in English. So how do we translate it and make it accessible to more people? Um, in our home
Wow.
languages, and then also looking at creating, this is a big hairy audacious goal. I'm in the process of working on it, and hopefully, and I'm now doing something that I always say I shouldn't, but I want to start an online magazine specifically targeted at Black women across the continent, to get them to think of themselves as creators first. Um, and that's something
Hmm.
I'm working on, and hopefully I will be able to get it up and running. It's a huge risk. Yeah, and so that's the direction that I'm taking.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nokwazi. This has been excellent.
Thank you.
That was Nokwazi Mzobe, founder and CEO, Matoyana Business Solutions. Her goal is to make knowledge accessible so people can create their own opportunities and solve their own problems. Nokwazi has gone beyond the business handbook she created and has a wealth of useful content and information for entrepreneurs on her website, so do check it out. Thank you so much for listening. People have asked how they can support us. 2 things. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Google Podcast apps and leave us a review on iTunes or Apple Podcast. Those 2 things will help us greatly. I am Akego Okoye, and you have been listening to African Business Stories.